Good morning, Lyssa here. Today, I really want to take a little bit of a dive into the change process. How many times have you had something, a habit you wanted to break, a new habit you wanted to develop, only to struggle with actually following through on this new habit? And so I want to talk a little bit about what happens as we try and develop new habits and why we often fail, but also what are some tools that might be useful in helping you actually navigate through the habit to formulating a new lifelong habit. There you go, lifelong habit. So a couple things that I think are really important. One, when we are looking at brain scans these days, what we're seeing is if the brain wants to habitualize behaviors, it just does, because it doesn't use as much glucose to feed itself if it can create a habit. So it optimizes itself by being a habit forming machine. To create a new habit requires us to use a lot of glucose. It's exhausting. The brain has to really work. It has to think through things in new ways. And it's not a reasonable long-term way of being. So the brain works very hard to create a habit out of anything new and quantify it, make a pattern out of it so that it can just do it unconsciously, working in the background. And we've all had this experience. So, if you've ever been around college students and they're soaking up a lot of new information, they eat a lot and they sleep a lot because their brain is really utilizing all the glucose that they can produce for it to integrate this new information into a new way of being, a new way of thinking. So first thing to understand is your brain doesn't really want to change. Even though you may want to change, your brain would prefer to stay the same, using its resources as smartly as possible. So the first thing that we have to overcome in any change process is the denial that we need a change, number one, and that the change is worth making. So we start off with, and let me just go really quickly through the 6 stages of the change process. There's denial, then awareness, then the desire to change, any blockers or fears that get in the way, the need to create a new story or new habit, a new way of being, and then the actions that will take you forward towards that new habit. So let's start with denial. Until we get to a place where we're ready to even be aware of and acknowledge that there's a change that we need to have, it is going to be really hard to make a change. So we may know something isn't working in our life, but we may not have really gotten clarity around what the change is that needs to happen. And we may be in denial about what the change is that needs to happen. So for instance, if I have a pattern of difficult relationships with people, there may be a belief that they're the problem and I'm just an innocent victim to this. As long as I'm going to stay in that idea of my innocence and my victimization in the relationship, I'm in denial of where my power is to make a change. And until I'm ready to explore that and what my influence on the situation might be, I'm not going to be able to make a change. So pushing through our denial is really step one, whatever that denial is. And we see it also in something like, let's say I want to be healthier. Maybe that's the habit I want to change because I find myself, I'm sitting too much. Maybe I work at a computer. Maybe I stand at a computer like I'm standing here right now, but I'm not necessarily really moving my body enough. And I really want to do that. But I have to overcome whatever the denial is that's stopping me from wanting to actually make that change. So I may have a denial that shows up as, exercise isn't fun. And if I'm in denial of that as a belief that I'm carrying, I'm going to have a real difficult time moving past that. So really, again, it is starting to ask yourself the questions around what is getting in the way of taking action. And the antidote to denial is getting curious on your own behalf. And take a moment to consider some situation in your life where you honestly want to have a change or you need a change. And let go of all the rationalizations, excuses, and the denial, and just get curious about what that change is that you're really seeking in your life, which rolls right into awareness. Once you recognize that there's this place that you really want to make a change, then it is about starting to get curious about what are the stories that are aligned with this old way of being, and what are the stories that you need that will be aligned with the new way of thinking. And so there's this story assessment that needs to go on as you're developing your awareness. So for me, if I'm looking at the idea of getting healthier, I do have a story about the fact that I don't like exercise, which is ridiculous because I love exercise when I'm doing it. But when I'm sitting on the couch and I don't feel like getting off the couch, I don't like it as much. And so I have to be really curious and notice what it is that I'm telling myself that might be getting in the way. So where are the stories that work for me? Where are the stories that hinder me? Where is the gap in the story between where I am right now and where I want to be? So if I want to be a person who's really active until old age, right, until I get really old, then what do I need to be doing in this gap between where I am now and where I want to be when, say, I'm 80? And really expanding my awareness about these stories, noticing what gets triggered, noticing the inner saboteur. We talked about that in an earlier one of these little videos, noticing that saboteur, recognizing it and calling it out, consciously calling it out so that we can change the story. Which takes us into desire. How badly do you want this? And I often say to myself and to clients, on a scale of 0 to 10, 0 being nothing, 10 being the highest level of commitment, how committed are you to this change? How much do you want it? And I don't work with people on changes that they're lukewarm on. If you are under an 8, I'm really curious why this is even coming up for you. Is it something that you think you're supposed to want? Is it something you think you're supposed to do? Is it something that society has said is important, and so you think that it's important for you? If you're not really high, like a high 8, 9, or 10 on the change process, your ability to maintain and push through any sort of difficulties is going to be quite hindered. So really, desire to make the change is epically important to our ability in this change process. Blocks, fears, and sticking points, these are all things to really continue to develop awareness about, but it's also one of the most common phases in the change process. We've all heard of falling off the wagon. I want to quit smoking. I want to quit drinking. I want to quit sitting on the couch. And it is so easy that we do really well for a little while. And then there comes a place where we've gone past our reserves of change. Our brain is like, please make this a habit. Please make this a habit, or default back to your old habit. And we tend to default back to our old habit. And so these fears, or this not wanting to do it, this sitting on the couch, this making excuses, whatever the blockers are, can really derail our forward trajectory. So knowing that the brain really doesn't enjoy changes, it is important then to find a way to support yourself through the inevitable moments of derailing that are going to come up. You're going to probably fall off the wagon at least once. I find that giving myself grace and compassion that this is normal, and then standing up and going and doing whatever it is that I say I need to do again is useful. The other thing that I think is a really great antidote to these blockers and fears is having accountability with somebody. So for instance, I had decided this year I was going to do a lot more movement and I was going to work on getting healthier. And so I spent January, February, March, and then I talked to my best friend. I said, I need an accountability partner. She said, me too. We both need accountability partners. So then in April, I start with an accountability with my friend, only to discover in April, May, and June, I'm not really exercising all that much more than I was exercising from January to March. So she and I had another conversation about the fact that what does the accountability need to look like so that we can really hold ourselves and each other accountable. And she came up with a really great idea of gamificating our accountability. We're both a little competitive, and so maybe a little more than a little, I'm not sure. Anyway, we're a bit competitive. And so she thought maybe we could have a game where we are in competition and the person who gets the most amount of exercise a month wins, and the other person, you know, they either get bragging rights or whatever they get. And then we tied money to it. So if you won, you got $25 or whatever the amount was that we agreed on for winning. And then the more that we were talking about it, the more clear it became that it wasn't that we're in competition with each other, we're in support of each other, we're in competition with ourselves. So we made an agreement, which was, if you exercise 20 days out of the month for 30 minutes, then you pass the litmus test and you won, right? And so both of us could win. And if you didn't get your 20 days in, you owe $50 to the other person for not getting your 20 days in, which is enough to make us like, I don't want to pay $50. I'd rather just give her $50, but I don't want to do it because I didn't do something. And if we both made it over 20 days, we'd put $25 in our own individual travel bucket for a trip that we might take that we will take together in a year. So we gamified it, and all of a sudden when I look, and so this started at the beginning of August. In August, I've worked out so far 20 days this month, which is something like a 300% increase over the 3 or 4 days that I was exercising in March. So huge shift. And really, I think last month when I look at July, I think I really managed to get my 30 minutes in like 6 times. So 20 days over 6 days is still like a gargantuan improvement in my follow through, right? So pushing through that inertia, giving myself grace, acknowledging the problem, and then getting help and support from somebody and making it fun, right? That's made it much more fun. So the next stage is creating a new story. We need to have a vision of where we're going. I honestly, if you ask me to make a goal of losing 10 pounds, it's going to be dead in the water in a week or two, because it isn't something that's going to really attach to my heart. But if I think of myself as like, you know, rocking out at 80, that's a totally different thing. Like I can totally get into the idea of being a dancing octogenarian, right? And so we need to create this new vision, and we need to be asking ourselves questions around, what is the importance of this to me? What would it look like? How would my life be different if I were doing this? If I met myself in a year, what do I want to hear I've accomplished over the last year since I started this new habit? What's going to be different in my life? We need to create the energy around this in order to be able to really integrate that desire deeply into our bones, and not just have it be something that we're doing in our mind. Which leads us then to the last step, which is actions and taking actions. And there's some work by BJ Fogg. I wrote about it in Storyjacking called Tiny Habits. And I really like what he talks about in Tiny Habits, because we all know, how do you eat an elephant, right? You don't just take one giant bite, you take lots of teeny little bites, right? This is a big thing, and we need to take tiny bite-sized mouthfuls so that we can chew it up and digest it and integrate it into our system before taking the next baby step. So we understand this cognitively, and yet we often even fail doing that. So what BJ Fogg talks about in Tiny Habits is this idea of linking habits. So if I have a habit of brushing my teeth, which I do, then if I also create at that time a habit of doing push-ups, then what I'm probably likely to do is, because I have a really long-standing habit of brushing my teeth, adding a habit to something I already do consistently means that I'm just building an extra step into my morning routine, versus I've got to create this whole new routine to add into my life, right? It doesn't feel so overwhelming and so big. And so it is this idea of how our brains work. We create neural networks, and these become superhighways after a long amount of time. Our habit is I wake up, I make coffee, I go check my email, I do blah, 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 blah. And that's the habit. To do something different out of that habit is going to take attention and desire and a plan and tiny steps. And so you can start to integrate little exit ramps on your superhighway so that you can get off, get some refueling, whether it's psychological, mental, emotional, spiritual, physical, right, at the rest stop, and then you can get back on the superhighway. And so we want to create these little exits off of these superhighways of our neural networks. And as we do that, those exits become new neural networks that are firmly entrenched in our brain. So I went a little bit long today. I hope this was useful, and best of luck working on changing your habits. If you ever want to work with me, you know how to get a hold of me. Send me an email. I do complimentary discovery sessions with people to see if we would be good working with each other. And beyond that, go out and be successful. Cheers.